All right, good morning, everyone. I see it is 9 o'clock at the moment, so it is time for us to start. I know some of the guests are still arriving and will be admitted into the webinar. So for now, a word of welcome. I'll do a bit more of a welcome a bit later on. This is a very unique situation in a sense that we are participating in an online webinar, which is already unique, and we are talking about technology and especially AI in theology. Now, by way of introducing the topic for today, I would just give a short overview of what we're going to discuss and what you might expect for today. Now, we all know AI, artificial intelligence, is here to stay. And due to this technological development, we know it might affect everything in life. We are only concerned today on how AI might affect theological education. Now, AI, we must understand, is set within the framework of technology, or rather, let me rephrase and say it's within a technocracy paradigm, meaning technology is governing our whole existence. Now, the interesting thing is, and there has been quite a lot of publications and research done on this, but how do we react to the presence of technology that fills our lives, that govern our lives? Now, there are two apparent ways from which one can respond to technology. One is by responding joyously, claiming that wonderful, the time has arrived. Technology is the big solution to everything. Technology will solve all our problems. Technology will make our lives easier. It will give a smooth education and training experience. As if technology might become the savior, bringing the salvation, to use theological terms in a positive way, how some might respond to technology. But the opposite response is just as valid. Many might respond by saying, you know what, technology is actually the big villain. Technology will affect us in negative ways. It will make us over-dependent on technology. It might take away the human touch, especially when it comes to education. So in that sense, technology might be viewed negatively, and some might respond negatively towards the advances of technology in our time. Now, we cannot deny that technology, and for our conversation's sake this morning, that AI will all aspects of life. We live under a new paradigm. When it comes in particular to AI in education, it's a very pertinent topic. It's a topic with growing importance. Just the past 2 days here at the University of Pretoria, we had a 2-day conference on technology in assessment, or AI's role in assessment. So universities across the globe are engaging in this issue of the use of AI, especially in education. Now, we realize AI will play an increasing role when it comes to education, tertiary education, and now also especially affecting theological training. Now, the webinar we are about to engage in today is the fruit, the result of almost 1 year long planning. The Northwest University and UP a year ago started these discussions on can we perhaps reach a point where we, in collaboration, present a webinar on this important topic. Now, the reaction to the planned webinar we are engaging today, the reaction was overwhelming. This you can also see from the amount of people that registered for this particular webinar. We have more than 190 people registered for today's webinar. Now, I know many of them will only participate in some part of the webinar, but 190 across the globe who wants to listen to what we have to say about AI in theology. Now, our aim with this particular webinar of today is not to solve any issues. We cannot pretend to bring the permanent solution. We can only try and analyze and discuss and highlight and emphasize some aspects. So consider today's goal as to be a preliminary investigation on the effect of AI on theological education. Preliminary, because my suspicion is big that there will be some more development in AI. So we can only say what we know today about AI in theology and education. Now, the goal would be to identify where can AI assist us, or what are potential pitfalls for AI when it comes to theological training. Now, with these few words, I would like to welcome each one who are interested in today's discussion. First of all, I would like to welcome the Dean of Northwest University, the Faculty of Theology, Professor Goede. I would like to welcome all the speakers, and we have a list of 6 speakers for today, and I'll introduce each one to you before they start speaking. So for now, welcome to each of these 6 speakers. But more important, I would also like to welcome all our listeners, all those who have registered for our webinar. And as I've mentioned, over the 190 did indicate they want to attend. So thank you for showing your interest in the topic. Thank you for your participation. There will be time for discussions, questions, so please share your thoughts as well. Now, it is our privilege here at the University of Pretoria to collaborate with Northwest University on presenting this webinar. So thank you for all of those who made it possible. I know at Northwest University, Nadine Smith especially contributed hugely to realizing today. So for now, only preliminary thanks to all those who made today possible. Now, before we start, perhaps just a reminder. This is an online conference, if you like, but there are important matters, and as you will note on the screen, there are some rules of engagement that I just like to remind all of us of. First of all, it would be preferable that those who are not speaking would turn their camera off. Now, during the question and answer sessions, you are welcome to open your camera, switch it on, ask your question, and wait for the response before switching off your camera again. So this is merely just for bandwidth purposes that we request you to be sensitive towards the use of your camera. For audibility, yes, please keep your mic on mute when not speaking. So that's quite obvious that it would affect all those listening when more than one microphone is switched on. So please refrain from using your mic when there's a speaker on a microphone. So just be sensitive towards that as well. Please feel free also to post questions in the chat box. You're more than welcome. We will from time to time get to those questions and remarks in the chat box itself, especially during the Q&A sessions. Then we will have a look at the chat box as well. Now, in order to give everyone a fair chance when it comes to the Q&A sessions, please raise your hand. There is a function, a button on the top toolbar that you can just click on to raise your hand should you have a question during the Q&A session. Please make use of that as well. So these are the normal rules of engagements that we would just like to remind you of to make sure that we all have a good experience of this webinar. You've all received the program for today, and just allow me a short overview of the program. There you have it on screen. 9:15, we will start with our keynote speaker, and that will take us up till 10 o'clock for our second speaker, Professor Tanya van Wyk, and then we will have a short tea break. Now this tea break is tricky. In this sense, you need to make sure for your own refreshments, and you can have whatever you like. So please use your freedom to spoil yourself with whatever you need during tea break. Let's say it's on the house. You make sure you enjoy a good tea break. Now, that's just merely a comfort break before we continue at 11 o'clock with our third speaker, Dr. Etienne van Heerden. And after Dr. van Heerden, we will have an opportunity to listen to Professor Rian Rede. And then at 12:40, we plan to have a second comfort break. Now, some might consider this a lunch break. It's not very long, only 10 minutes. So after the comfort break at 12:50, 10 to 1, we will have an opportunity to listen to Mr. Tertius Nieuwoud. And then finally at 1:30, we will have an opportunity to listen to Ms. Zongi Masia. And then at 2 o'clock, we plan to complete our webinar, and Professor Henny Goede will then speak a word of closing. So that's the program for today. A very exciting program, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the speakers who are participating in our program. So please keep your program at hand. In the information pack, you also receive some notes as to an introduction to all 6 our speakers. I will introduce our speakers, but you have the information at hand. You even have their email contacts should you want to take up a conversation with them after today. So this is a wonderful occasion that we eventually reach this point where we are able to present this wonderful webinar on this very important topic. Just a prediction, we plan to avail this recording to those who would like to review it and share it with others. So eventually this will be also available online, I believe in some YouTube channel, either from Northwest or UP. So there is this promise of to come. So that concludes all the remarks I wanted to make before we start. So now it's almost 9:15 and time for our keynote speaker to address us. And I would like to give a short introduction to the keynote speaker, Professor Johan Strijdom. Now, Professor Johan Strijdom is currently at the University of South Africa here in Pretoria. May I allow me to introduce to you Johan Strijdom. Is a professor in religious studies at UNISA. His teaching and research interests have focused on critical theories and key concepts in the study of religion, the application of such theorized concepts to material mediations of religion, and a disciplined comparison of case studies illustrating pertinent issues and concepts across religious traditions in order to produce new knowledge on the chosen case studies and critical issues. Now, Johan Strijdom might be familiar. You might be familiar with him. He's a well-known scholar, highly published, highly regarded internationally. Indeed, a wonderful privilege for us to have Professor Johan Strijdom address us. Johan, thank you. The microphone is now yours. We are eager to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaco, and thank you for the invitation to open this conference. My topic, what is AI? For this webinar on AI for theology, and since I come from religious studies, you'll see I integrate that perspective as well. Artificial intelligence, AI, an intensely debated issue. The impact of artificial intelligence on society and our world has recently become an intensely debated issue. Included in the debate have been fields as diverse as the environment, arts, entertainment, finances, government, warfare, law, healthcare, and education. On the one hand, it has been praised as having the potential of bringing solutions to all our problems. On the other hand, it has been denounced as posing a potential threat to human existence. Between these utopian and dystopian alternatives, several more nuanced positions have been taken. In this presentation, we will attend to these assessments. AI for religious studies and theology. Since religion is embedded in society, the fields of religious studies and theology cannot escape the impact of AI. The topic of discussion of our virtual gathering here today. My task will be to introduce the issue by considering what AI is. I will do so in 2 parts. First, in a theoretical part, I will define the key term artificial intelligence in comparison with the term human intelligence, emphasizing the need for a critical engagement with this new technology. Secondly, in a practical part, I will consider types of generative AI and how the technology works, again stressing and illustrating why a critical engagement with generative AI is imperative. In the presentation, I will relate the issue of generative AI to the study of religion and theology. By the study of religion, the academic field from which I speak, I understand the non-confessional comparative and historical study of religions. By theology, the academic field that I studied many years ago, I understand the study of a particular religious tradition from a confessional perspective. I understand, however, that there are overlaps between these fields when textual sources are studied in a historical critical way. Part 1, theory. Defining the key term artificial intelligence in comparison with human intelligence. The concept of artificial intelligence has, since its emergence in the 1950s, often been conceived by analogy to human intelligence. Turing's idea was to create a machine, more precisely a digital computer, that would perform certain tasks in such a way that it would be impossible to tell whether a task was performed by a human being or a machine. Insofar as the concept of intelligence is central to the analogy, the question, what is artificial intelligence, might be defined in comparison with the concept of human intelligence. By comparing human intelligence with artificial intelligence in terms of similarities and differences, each type of intelligence might shed light on the other and on the question itself. One way to give content to the term human intelligence is by locating it within epistemological, hermeneutical, social anthropological, and critical traditions. Additionally, insights from cognitive scientists and neurobiologists provide valuable perspectives that complement and enrich our understanding of human intelligence, specifically insofar as they have contemplated the relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. Philosophers in the Western tradition often trace the epistemological question back to the rationalist and empiricist answers of the early modern era. According to rationalists, humans know the world on account of categories that they are born with and that are in their mind, such as time, place, number, and cause. According to empiricists, humans know the world in the first place through their senses. Immanuel Kant is then credited for combining these traditions. In philosophical hermeneutics, Husserl argued that we do not know things in themselves, but as they appear to us. Bracketing our presuppositions in order to see the phenomena in our consciousness would in this view be a methodological requirement for scientific knowledge. Gadamer, on the other hand, held that the role of presuppositions in the process of understanding needs to be acknowledged, since they not only get us interested in trying to understand an issue, but they may also be changed in the process. Sociologists have insisted that knowledge production by humans are necessarily constructed and embedded in historical, social, political, and economic contexts, while anthropologists have made this epistemological claim even more specific by locating knowledge production within particular communities. Of crucial importance for us is the contribution of critical theorists to the epistemological debate, since they have foregrounded systemic and embodied asymmetrical power relations. Postcolonial theorists have shown how the production of knowledge from a location in the global south may differ from that in the global north, often foregrounding race and emphasizing the perspectives of people of color. Theorists in the Marxist tradition have stressed knowledge by and from workers and the poor. Gender critics have done the same for LGBTIQ+ people. In contemplating the relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, the cognitive scientist David Chalmers has recently argued that AI models, or more specifically large language models, LLMs, as a type of AI, can at least be said to think, to some extent, in accordance with a rationalist epistemological tradition. John Searle, on the other hand, has insisted on the difference between human and artificial intelligence by arguing that without sensory engagement, artificial intelligence cannot be said to be like human intelligence. The latter involves intentionality or direction towards the world through the senses, which AI is not capable of. It is, of course, still early to say to what extent sensors that allow the latest robotic machines to interact with and learn from the external world and engage emotionally with humans would pose a challenge to Searle's argument. Of primary concern to us, however, would again be the field of critical AI studies. Shifting the focus from the technical workings of AI, these scholars use critical theories to assess the outputs of AI models and the role of AI in society and our world. But to apply a hermeneutics of suspicion to the outputs and usage of AI models, we need to have a basic understanding of the types of AI and how they work. Part 2, practice, types of AI. Accepting that we are at present still far away from artificial general intelligence, AGI, that aims at matching or surpassing human intelligence in all respects, a prominent theme within the genre of science fiction, we may choose to realistically focus on current generative artificial intelligence, generative AI models that can create new texts, images, music, videos, or code, and that can convert one content type into another. for example, text into image or vice versa. We may furthermore, in order to get a basic understanding of how generative AI models work, choose to focus here on large language models as a specific type of generative AI that creates text. Among the tasks that create specifically text, among the tasks that such models perform are not only the generation of summaries, translations, and editing of texts, but also the brainstorming of ideas. How do these models do this, and why should it call for our critical engagement? How do generative AI models work? Generative AI models depend on the data set that they are trained on. From this data set, a generative AI model identifies or learns patterns that enable it to produce an output as response to the prompt from a user. In the case of a large language model, the input or prompt from a user is in the form of text, and the output or response from the model too is in the form of text. In response to a prompt from a user, the model uses an algorithm to generate an answer in which the weights or statistical frequency of word combinations in its dataset play an important role. Formulating clearly, limiting the corpus on which the model must draw, assuming there's sufficient data on the specific corpus in the dataset, and giving context in a prompt can assist the model to give better responses. But if the dataset is biased in terms of gender or race, as would be the case with historical Western data, the same prejudices will reflect in the output. One way to address this is to set ethical guardrails in an attempt to constrain the model from reproducing such biases. Human interventions that are seemingly not easy, but that a number of governments are actively seeking through legal regulations. Morally, theologians from their own confessional traditions and scholars of religion from a human rights perspective should be involved in this debate. These are critical ethical issues that will, as far as I can see from today's program, receive attention from our speakers. Examples. To illustrate the critical competencies needed by theologians and scholars of religion to responsibly engage with current generative AI models, I will first test the performance of a selection of these models on the translation and exegesis of texts from the New Testament. This interest goes back to my theological education in the Protestant tradition that prioritized texts, but also overlaps with the focus of the Protestant founders of the academic study of religious on sacred texts. I will next turn to assess the extent to which these AI models effectively apply theories to analyze contemporary religious movements. This interest stems from my current location in the study of religions, where the focus has shifted from philological textual analysis to a social anthropological and material analysis of religious movements. While these examples are necessarily limited and should be expanded by much more extensive experimentation with generative AI models, they should sufficiently demonstrate the critical competencies that are required for students and researchers in theology and the study of religions. Since the free ChatGPT version is pre-trained on dated internet data, prone to hallucinations, that is, it often makes up answers, and does not provide the sources on which it draws for its responses, I will limit my experiment to Google's Gemini and Microsoft's Copilot. Both scrape the current internet for open resources, each presumably using its own search engine of Google and Bing, respectively. Example 1, translation. The Gospel of Mark begins by introducing John the Baptist, or better baptizer, as the forerunner of Jesus Christ. In the Greek text, we read the following, for which the latest editions provide no contesting variants in their text critical notes. Mark 1:4b, Kerison baptisma metanoias eis aphesen amartion, literally preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Applying a dynamic equivalent theory of translation to this text, in which meaning instead of words should be translated from source text to target text, each word that expresses an event can be translated into a kernel sentence, in which subjects and direct objects, if it is a transitive verb, can be made explicit. The kernel sentence of our example might then be rendered as follows. John the Baptist preached, let's provide an object, a message. John the Baptist baptized people. People repent. God forgives people. People sin. The theory furthermore posits that the relationship between these kernel sentences can be made explicit by attending to grammatical markers such as noun cases and prepositions. In our example, baptism in the accusative case is the direct object of preaching. The genitive cases of repentance and of sins precede in terms of time the event nouns, the nomina actionis, that they qualify, baptism and forgiveness respectively. And the preposition eis, for, towards, expresses the purpose of the preceding clause. We may then make the relations between the kernel sentences explicit in this way. John the Baptist preached that people should repent and be baptized by him so that God can forgive their sins. The Good News Bible, today's English version, based on the dynamic equivalent translation theory, gives the following translation of Mark 1:4. So John appeared in the desert, baptizing and preaching, turn away from your sins and be baptized, turning it into imperatives. He told the people, and God will forgive your sins. So interestingly here, the preposition eis is not rendered as expressing purpose, but is simply translated by the conjunction and. The 1983 new translation of the Bible into Afrikaans, also based on the dynamic equivalent translation theory, translates Mark 1:4 as follows. So het Johannes die doper in die woestyn opgetree. Hy het verkondig dat die mense hulle moet bekeer, sodat God hulle sondes kan vergewe en dat hulle moet laat doop. Interestingly here, metanoias as afis and amartion is seen as a unit that precedes the ritual of baptism. The 2020 translation of the Bible into Afrikaans, for which I served as source expert of the Gospel of Mark and Paul's letter to the Romans, applied a source-oriented theory of translation, which aimed to keep the style and nuances of the source text in the target text as far as possible. Mark 1:4b was now rendered as Johannes het die doop van bekering met die oog op die vergewing van sondes verkondig. Interestingly, this translation is quite close to the first translation of the Bible into Afrikaans of 1933, which offered a literal translation of the source text in the target text. Johannes was besig om die doop van bekering tot vergifnis van sondes te verkondig. With this prior knowledge, we may now prompt Gemini and Copilot to answer questions on this example and assess their responses. Taking the sequence of the questions into consideration, each exchange is remembered by the model, creating a limited context that is taken into account for the subsequent exchange. I pose the following questions to these two models. Prompt 1. What is meant by a dynamic equivalent translation of the Bible? General contextual question, but specific enough to say it's about the dynamic equivalent translation of the Bible. Prompt 2, illustrate the application of this theory by offering a dynamic equivalent translation in English of Gerison baptisma metanoias eis afis en amartion in Mark 1:4. Clarify your analysis of the phrase to produce this translation. So I asked the models to produce their own dynamic equivalent translations. Then prompt 3, I go to the Good News Bible. A concrete example, I say, give the translation of the Good News Bible of this verse. Explain the steps that were followed by the Good News to produce this dynamic equivalent translation. And lastly, I move to the Afrikaans translations, expecting that there's not enough data on Afrikaans in the data set. As I said, the answers depend on what is in the data set, because it must learn patterns from extensive data set. So I asked the 1983 translation of the Bible into Afrikaans applied a dynamic equivalent translation, but the 2020 translation of the Bible into Afrikaans applied a source-oriented translation. How do these two translation theories differ? Give the translations of Mark 1:4 in both translations and explain the differences. So let's compare them here in the table, which I won't read. I'll just point out some things there. So on the first question, they do pretty well. There's enough information in the data set. They recognize the patterns. I didn't see any problems there. If I were to mark this as a student assignment, I would give high marks, except in the case of the sources. Gemini doesn't even give the sources here, whereas Copilot does. And unfortunately, it can only draw on open access sources. So books that have copyright, they can't draw on. So you see strange sources there, like the Lord's Library, Answer the Bible, and so on. One would not like students, for example, to use those, but the model is forced to use those. At the end of that answer, one is given also the opportunity to give a thumbs up or thumbs down, and also a small window that appears to explain why. Now, this is called teaching by reinforcement, where external intervention is possible, and it's very costly to employ experts, to do this kind of monitoring and reinforcement. So users are given the opportunity. The downside of that is, of course, that anyone can give a thumbs up and thumbs down. So does the model really improve by that means of intervention? Prompt 2, we go to, I ask the models to give their own dynamic equivalent translation and to clarify it. Now, interestingly enough, they would give very general things there, and not one of them actually go into the technical detail of transforming event words into kernel sentences and making, the relations explicit, which is very, very basic in the literature of the United Bible Society and their translators' handbooks. So it gives a very, very traditional kind of passing of the words. Charisma is a participle, baptisma is a noun, metanoia is a genitive, and nothing more than that. So the syntax is not explained. When Copilot gives a translation as a dynamic translation, when it comes across as a very literal one, actually. John proclaimed the baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins in the wilderness. In the wilderness was actually preceding the whole sentence at the beginning of that verse. So not very helpful. I would not give a student very good marks for this one. But if you look at the sources that are provided, in the case of Copilot, in the case of Gemini, no sources are even provided. In the case of Copilot, again, you can see Bible Hub, Answer the Bible, Lord's Library, and so on, and no really primary sources there that would have been really helpful for us. Okay, so then the third prompt, now we go to the Good News Bible, where we have a concrete example of a dynamic equivalent one. I asked them to quote the verse. Both of them had access to that information. They quoted it exactly as it is. And then they have to explain, how does it get from the Greek text to this specific dynamic equivalent translation. Again, they struggle. Copilot is the worst. Equivalent, natural, closest. Nothing about the technicality of translation, step by step, from the source text to the target text. Point 1, under column 1 of Gemini, a thorough study of the original Greek text, including grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. Nothing about the paradigm that is followed here to do the translation. Okay, so moving on to prompt 4, and you can see just before prompt 4, the Swedenborgian community is given there as the one source that Gemini drew on. Prompt 4, we get to the Afrikaans. Okay, now interesting to me, as I say, in the case of Gemini, it uses Google. In the case of Copilot, it uses Bing. And what in the first column, Gemini tells us, you see the red there? I couldn't find the exact wording of both translations without access to the specific texts. The examples below are approximations based on common translation approaches. So it hallucinates, it makes up its own translation in Afrikaans, and its Afrikaans is not very good. Look there. Johannes het in die wildernis gepreek en daar boodskap van bekering gebring om sonde vergewe te kry. And the 2020 gepredik, kind of archaic word in Afrikaans. So it's hallucinating, and it warns one again in its analysis. A detailed analysis would require comparing the actual texts, and you see the source that he drew on, the one there. It's in the open domain, these translations. Bing for Copilot found it. So it gave the translation, but the 1983 one is not exactly like the 1983 that I have. Here it is closer to the new, the TEV, today's English version, where hy het verkondig, bekeer julle en laat julle doop en God sal julle sondes vergewe. In other words, the event words are here translated as imperatives, whereas in the 1983 it's in indirect speech. Dat die mense hulle moet bekeer sodat God hulle sondes kan vergewe, and as I said, en dat hulle moet laat doop, strangely, transposed to the end of that sentence. So when it gets to the 2021, there it found the correct translation. And you can see it drew on the BibleEssay.co.za. Maybe that the Bible Essay, that website doesn't have the 83 translation. I haven't checked. But you have Wikipedia articles and so on. You have an article from HDS on it, for example, which is interesting. So it gives its sources, but again, some are doubtable, some are more trustworthy. Okay, so let's get to the exegesis, the second example. Historical critical scholars of the New Testament generally agree on the basis of stylistic and content differences that one should distinguish between the authentic letters written by the historical Paul on the one hand and the pastoral epistles 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus that were written later in Paul's name on the other hand. One difference, even contradiction in content, concerns the place of women in these texts. In 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 15, we read the following instruction. The women learn in silence with full submission. Gine, en Hesekia, Manthaneto, en Pase Putage. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Didaskene, de Ginaiki, uk epitrepo, ude authentijn andros, al eina en Hesekia. And then the justification, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. There's no room here for women in leadership positions in the church, which is also clear from the following instruction in Timothy and Titus, where only married men with children would qualify for leadership positions as overseers, elders, or deacons in the church. A bishop, episkopos, literally overseer, must be above reproach, married only once. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. Let deacons, diakonoi, be married only once, and let them manage their children and their households well. Appoint elders, presbyteroi, in every town, as I directed you, someone who is blameless, married only once, whose children are believers, not accused of debauchery and not rebellious. These instructions are quite different from Paul's position on a celibate leader of his house churches and the role of women in those churches. Not only does Paul state in Galatians 3:28 that in his house churches there's no longer male and female, with all equal before God, but in his house churches, women such as Phoebe and Priscilla played prominent leadership roles. Phoebe, for example, as deacon, diakonos, in the house church of Corinth, of a house church in Corinth, were to carry his letter to the Romans, Romans 16. One explanation for this shift from a prominent and equal role of women in Paul's house churches to a subservient role in the pastoral epistles is that the latter reverted to the Roman patriarchal values of their time. I posed the following questions to Gemini and Copilot. 3 prompts. Compare Paul's view of women in Galatians 3 and Romans 16 with the pastoral epistles view of women in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. How do historical critical scholars explain the different views of women in these texts? Prompt 2. Some readers argue that there is no contradiction on the role of women in these verses. Give their main arguments. So thesis and antithesis. Historical critical and those who harmonize these texts. Prompt 3. If you weigh the arguments, now I ask for the model's own opinion. That's when it begins to struggle. You'll see. If you weigh the arguments of the historical critics and those who attempt to harmonize the views of women in these verses, which side's arguments do you find most convincing and why? So, prompt 1. Just compare them. Give the verses. Fine. If you look at Gemini, it gives Galatians 3, it gives Romans 16, it gives the pastoral epistles, it has access to that data. Then it gives a pretty good, list of reasons that historical critical scholars would give. The authors differ, not written by Paul. The pastoral epistles were written later in the name of Paul. Different contexts. So you have the 50s and later, although I made a red mark there, because it says Galatians and Romans might reflect a more ideal vision of Christian equality. Pastoral epistles face specific cultural pressures and challenges. But what about Phoebe? I mean, that's not just an ideal vision. And Priscilla, those are female leaders according to the historical critical reading. The literary genres, again, Galatians and Romans address theological and ethical issues. So it doesn't take Phoebe, seriously there and the female leaders. Cultural influences, yeah, so that is an explanation that in the case of the pastoral epistles, they reverted back to the Roman values of the time. You see one source given, you see a few sources given there. Viral believers sounded a bit strange to me, but interesting, the last one is from Silo in die Skriflig, and it says that it's Robin Branch who is affiliated to Northwestern University, also at the American University. So generally not bad, these answers. When we go to Copilot's answers to the same questions, his response, again, it gets Galatians 3:28. But then it says, that neither Jew nor Greek, slave-free, male, female reflects first century ideals of a unified community. Of course, just the opposite. It is a radical diversion from the dominant ethos or ideals of the first century. So that is not correct. I would mark that one down. You go on, then explanations, these are now more from the people who harmonize, so what on the data set that is used by Copilot, it got more the conservative view of harmonizing than was the case by Gemini. So I marked some of the things. There's even a contradiction because, as you can see, I see the contradiction. It says historical critical scholars' perspective, there's tension between cultural norms and the radical equality. But you remember up there it said it was actually in line with first century ideals. So the models can't really reason. That is one point that Jaco of Meta, a very prominent guy with AI, and a professor also at New York University, I think. He said, these models can't reason. They just draw from their data set, and the dominant views are then presented here. Now, of course, there may be many dominant views, then it would randomly choose. So if I redo these questions now on the two models, I will get different answers. If I do in a year's time, the data set will have changed, different answers will be given again, which just stresses the point that one must critically engage with the answers. If you look at the sources of Copilot, a lot from check.com. Now, that's in the open domain, but that is, a website for students to go to pay and have their assignments done. So what kind of source is that? Those a student quoting one of those, imagine. From two. So now this is the more conservative view. So the people who harmonize, the texts. So I made some notes there. My main concern was, again, it doesn't address the issue of Phoebe. How is the issue of the female leaders addressed? And unfortunately, it doesn't give you sources there for the conservative view. Prompt 2 for Copilot, it repeats what it said above. And it says Galatians 3 and Romans 16 emphasize complementary roles. Not really spelled out what is meant by there. Again, no sources given here either. So one doesn't know where to go, where it got from, and it even give a face there, a shy face there. Prompt 3, make up your own mind. What would you choose? Okay. It says that it depends. They don't take sides. They are draadsitters, as we say. They say, you should take both into account. It's best for a comprehensive view, to say both are correct. Of course, neither historical critical scholars nor the harmonizers would be happy with combining opposite views. So no consistent argument here. But what is helpful with Gemini is that it says it depends on one's view of scripture. Skrifbeschouwing, as you say. If you have an organic view, an historical critical view of the Bible, you would think that it consists of a collection of texts and there are tensions in them, whereas more conservative people would try to harmonize and say it's the word of God from the beginning till the end, and it's infallible and so on, and therefore there can't be contradictions in the Bible. So I'm testing it here. It doesn't take any side. It just said a balanced perspective is needed, incorporates both historical, critical, and harmonizing perspectives. So how do you do that? For Copilot, it immediately said as an AI language, for Copilot, as an AI language model, I don't hold personal opinions or beliefs, but I can provide insights based on scholarly perspectives. So it's just going to give both again, and it's going to say, it's essentially to engage with both, consider the broader theological framework, and so on, again, with an embarrassed face there at the end. And the harmonizers, the strengths it seek to reconcile apparent contradictions, emphasize complementary roles, and so on. Some of the points here helpful, but some not very helpful. So let's see the time. I still have 15 minutes. I get to the last example, 3, applying theories to analyze religious movements. My third example moves from sacred text to religious movement. Religion is here conceptualized in a broad sense by adapting Durkheim's definition of religion as referring to beliefs, myths or sacred stories and doctrines, and practices, rituals and ceremonies that serve to unite adherents into a community of shared values. Arguing that totemism as pre-animistic religion contained the most basic elements of religion, Durkheim uses sacred in the sense of anything that is considered special or extraordinary by adherents. The internationally acknowledged American South African scholar of religion, David Chidester, has used this broad definition, supplemented with Georges Bataille's theory of religion, to analyze the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa as functioning like a religion. Not only did its ecstatic collective rituals create social solidarity between fans in the Durkheimian sense, but it also entailed extravagant or excessive expenditure, a sacrifice of resources like a potlatch that for Bataille characterizes religion and is needed to regenerate society, notably in a capitalist economy. To test the performance of the selected LLMs on this example, I pose the following questions. Prompt 1. Briefly compare Émile Durkheim and Georges Bataille's theories of religion, just to make sure that we are on the same page, because that will be remembered now as the context and important then for the follow-up questions. Prompt 2. Now summarize David Chidester's application of Bataille's theory of religion to analyze the 2020 FIFA World Cup in South Africa. Also want to see whether it has access to that copyrighted book or maybe an article that Chidester wrote. Prompt 3. In which respects can Chidester's application of Bataille's theory to analyze the 2010 World Cup be criticized? Which theories inform such critiques? List the sources on which you draw for your response. Okay, so let's see how it performs. Gemini, on the first question, Durkheim and Georges Bataille, as well as Copilot, pretty well. They have a lot of information on both of these theorists. Good marks here. Except in Copilot, the term transcending ordinary life is used. Without defining transcending, it would be problematic because beliefs in a transcendental deity is not an essential element of religion in the Durkheimian definition. Or when it says it contributes to the fabric, religion contributes to the fabric of our shared beliefs and practices, that's a tautological statement. I mean, the point is that the shared beliefs and practices unite adherents into one moral community. So, but generally not bad. No sources provided there in the first column. In the second column for Copilot, Oxford bibliographies, that would be a good source. Archive.org, revised sociology. But generally, the synthesis that he produced here, not too bad. And of course, as I said, the whole point here is to say that with my prior knowledge, I'm able to mark this outcome, which is absolutely necessary. So this is to realize, to what extent one can use the model. What are the limitations? What are the benefits? So then we get in prompt 2 to summarize to Chidester. How does he apply it? For Gemini, fairly good summary, but it says this expenditure serves to maintain social order. Actually, it serves to disrupt order, which would be necessary to recreate or regenerate society. And it said it prevent the accumulation of surplus that could threaten it. Not a clear formulation. Further down there, some would ultimately lose. This loss, however, was not seen as a tragedy, but rather as a necessary part of the game. That is not Bataille. It is not applied in Chidester. And it also said it was a way for the country to showcase its culture and diversity to the world. Now, that's also not Bataille. It gets it from somewhere. It may be true, but it is not the application of Bataillean theory. Again, the use of transcendence here as well. It reflected the hopes and dreams of a nation emerging from a dark past, not in Bataille. So the sources, interestingly, it uses an article that I wrote, and then it uses some other articles there. But since I know my own article, I can say that he didn't capture my points well there when he quotes me. Prompt 2 in the second column for Copilot, it says it's about the intersection. Point 1, it quotes Wild Religion. Of course, it is a chapter in Wild Religion that deals with the World Cup. The statement there is correct. It also draws there on a summary of Chidester's book and later also on one of my articles. But that is not relevant to the question. That is not relevant to the question. The second point there is relevant, and the summary, and then the open access sources here are academic sources. So it didn't fare too badly. Prompt 3. Okay, so now I ask for the opinion. What critiques are, and it can draw on its database, and it can say what theories inform it, and it begins to hallucinate. It struggles there. It just said, yeah, some key critiques: reductionism, structuralism, post-structuralism, cultural studies. Nicely organized, every time the theory and the critique. But if you read carefully through it, it just doesn't make sense. Post-colonial studies, it says, Chittister's analysis, Eurocentric, privileging Western theories. You know, the whole claim to fame of Chittister is exactly to speak from a South African perspective and apply theories from a post-colonial perspective. So these general points that are made are not valid, and it doesn't give the sources. Some critics. It gives generally academic articles here. You see that. It probably hallucinated the second one, various articles in journals, various books on the sociology. It quotes authentic fakes, which is not the relevant one from Chittister, because how would he criticize himself there? And in that book, it deals with American popular culture, not with the World Cup here. Okay, so getting then to the second column, to co-pilot, I said it has a selective focus. It overlooked broader religious dynamics and alternative interpretations, which it actually multiplies interpretations. And even in this case, he has several others as well. It quotes the EMEA source, and that was not the critique that I had against Chittister there. It was about not taking Marxist, not weighing different theories for their differences, the Bataillean one with Marxist ones, which would emphasize the loss to poor people when the World Cup was hosted here. So it didn't capture me, it's not incorrect. Some scholars again, you see, various scholarly discussions on the contextual aspects of Chittister's work as the source, ethnographic bias. He is an anthropological scholar of religion. So these are not valid. And again, if you look at the sources there, you see check, viola in music and so on. I went into those. It's just not acceptable academically. Okay, so let's get to the conclusion. What have we achieved in this presentation? Let me summarize in 3 points. 1, the analogy between artificial and human intelligence. Although the ideal has been to create intelligent machines that would match human intelligence, it is clear that human beings know the world not only through rational categories, but also by interaction with and experience of the world. They do so from a particular embedded location and tradition that make it possible to engage critically with the world. 2, the imperative for critical engagement. The outputs of generative AI, more precisely LLMs, cannot be accepted blindly, but must be engaged critically by users from their own locations and traditions. Such critical engagement is imperative, since generative AI outputs depend on the dataset on which the models are trained. If the dataset does not contain sufficient data to answer the questions, the model may make up the response, hallucinate, on the basis of probability. If the dataset is gender or racially biased, these biases might reflect in the output. 3, examples to test the models. To illustrate the need for theologians and scholars of religion to critically engage with LLMs, we tested the responses of Gemini and Copilot to questions on the translation and exegesis of sacred texts, as well as the analysis of religious movements. These reflections have surely only touched on some aspects of our theme on AI for theology. I'm looking forward to hear our colleagues and the audience here take this further today in discussing this new technology, its impact on and usage by society and religious institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you for your contribution. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. I see we have 5 minutes time, so I don't want to waste our time. If there are urgent questions, you're more than welcome either to raise your hand and pose your question. Perhaps just for a kickoff in terms of short questions, I enjoyed your paper. Thank you for the presentation. You indicated that many of these models claim to present the dominant views. Now, the phrase dominant views captured my imagination, and I was just thinking, whose dominant views? I suspect many of these models make use of the large language models that were generated and created in the USA and Europe, for example. So it would not necessarily capture an African perspective. Am I correct in assuming that? So I was just thinking in terms of an introductory question. Meanwhile, others are welcome to either type their questions in the chat box or raise their hands to indicate a question. Thank you.
Yeah, Jaco, if I may answer that question, as I say, it depends on the data set. And just yesterday, I saw a graph, or it's actually like a circle, showing geographically what the contributions from different areas in the world would be to the database. Most from Asia, not America as one would think, and Africa only like 4 or 5%. So very little in the database to go by. And that database is basically drawn from open access sources, not from books, academic sources that are sold. So the articles that you saw there in my examples are open access, like HTS, for example, or Indiskriflig. Sometimes it will draw on Google Books, but only the section that lies there in the open domain. So Reddit, for example, and Twitter, X, that is the kind of information that will go into it. So that would be the dominant views that are drawn on. And this says a lot about the potential for innovation as well. Innovation is often attributed to a minority view, someone who comes up with a bright idea, a bright theory, like Chomsky, for example, that would bring a new view on language. Chomsky's critique, by the way, of these large language models is that it is nothing but plagiarism. It draws here and there from the net, from everywhere. It synthesizes it according to the most probable next word. It's plagiarism because it does not give full recognition to its sources. It's just a synthesis. So I am not hopeful that one would really get new perspectives from these models, but I must also say, in trying few of these things, it can give you some ideas that you can take further.
Thank you. Are there perhaps any other questions? I think we can have 1 more minute for a question, perhaps a quick, short question. I don't see any hands raised. Are there any urgent questions? Please, you're more than welcome to either type a question in the chat box, and to this, Johan can respond if he wishes so, or otherwise you have his email address and you're welcome to send him an email if you have something urgent that you would like to ask. I see there's a question. Yes, please, NHK Pirni, if you're welcome to, Dion de Toy, you're welcome to pose your question.
Thank you. Yes, I'm just using my church ID to participate. My name is Dion. Thank you very much for this informative paper. My question is maybe just hypothetical, and that is, would a better way to, in essence, then test students on knowledge is to reverse the sequence of question and answer, so that we actually first provide answers and then request critique on an answer that was generated by one of these AI or multiple AI models?
Yeah, if I understand you correctly, one can do that if for example, the background that I gave, my prior knowledge, my questions were actually based on that. I have tried many things. You can also edit your questions, but what worked best, it seemed to me, was to begin with a context, to sketch a context, and then give more specific prompts after that. Now, there's a limit to the number of prompts you can give. They call it the windows, the tokens that can be used, and the models are improving for that. So, yeah, I was thinking on how to test students with the issue of plagiarism and so on. And one way would be to work carefully through an article, an academic article with them, and then to present them with a summary of that article. And then they must identify points that were missed and points that were actually captured in that summary. So that would be one assignment that I have been thinking about, but we'll have to experiment and see how we can teach students to critically engage with it, not to abstain from it, but to critically engage with it, to use this new tool, like they would use Google searches. I mean, you get a lot of nonsense when you do a Google search, and you have to decide, which ones would be useful for your purpose, and where you would agree or disagree then eventually with the sources, make up your own arguments.
Thank you, Johan. That brings us to 10 o'clock. Thank you for the discussion. As I've indicated, you're more than welcome to continue the conversation with Johan in the chat box or personal email. Johan, thank you for now for your contribution. Really appreciate it. That was a wonderful way of opening our discussion, setting the scene for how we should discuss AI in theology education further. Thank you. And this brings us to our second speaker. This is for Professor Tanya van Wyk. If you allow me to introduce her shortly, you have her information in the information pack, but I'll gladly introduce Tanya, a good colleague of mine. So Professor Tanya van Wyk is an associate professor of systematic theology and Christian ethics at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria. Now, she's also the chairperson of the faculty's Research Ethics Committee. Current research foci include feminist ethics, inclusive language discourse, and women in leadership. Tanya, thank you. The microphone is now yours. We are looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaco, for the introduction. And yeah, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here and also to participate in this conversation. There you see the topic of my presentation this morning. And I think what's going to happen today inevitably is that there are going to be some themes that are going to link to each other. And our previous speaker already referred to this. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So let's go to the outline of what I'm going to share with you this morning. First, I want to do an introduction about how we speak about the default. Then I want to go on to speak about how we understand bias and prejudice. I want to talk a little bit about a response, maybe different approaches, culture or community engagement, or a human rights value approach. And then I want to make some concluding remarks on social disruption and what it means to reconceptualize. So I'll start with a poem based on a myth, and some of you might know this, the myth of Oedipus. And there it is for you on the screen. Long afterwards, Oedipus, old and blinded, walked the roads. He smelled a familiar smell. It was the Sphinx. Oedipus said, "I want to ask one question. Why didn't I recognize my mother?" "You gave the wrong answer," said the Sphinx. "But that was what made everything possible," said Oedipus. "No," she said. "When I asked what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening, you answered, man. You didn't say anything about woman." When you say man, said Oedipus, you include women too. Everyone knows that." She said, "That's what you think." We have all experienced the gut-wrenching shock of a computer or a phone or a tablet that can't be switched on, or the screen that has got stuck, or the processor that cannot start the sequence of actually starting the computer. We commonly refer to it as a crash, which aptly describes the chaos and shock that accompanies the violent collision of matter. The most common response: "I hope your files were backed up or stored in a cloud of some sort, because your device will have to be reset to the factory default settings." A dictionary search of default yields that it refers to a pre-selected option adopted by a computer program or other mechanism when no alternative is specified by the user or the programmer. Now, I wonder if the idea of default settings are supposed to be reassuring, because at least there is a baseline or a departure point, right? What happens in actual fact is that reverting back to those factory settings leaves us with a feeling of uncertainty or a feeling of having to start from scratch. However, if you think just a little further, what is it that really makes you uncomfortable? Is it the fact that your own preferences have been wiped off of your device? Or is it because you have to depend on the departure point or the default setting of someone else? Do we ever worry about who decides whose default settings were chosen? Do we accept them just as a matter of course? The myth of Oedipus, as depicted in Muriel Rakese's poem, epitomizes our blind spots about our default paradigms and those things we don't see, or we might have chosen not to see. Because if we see those things, they might lead to a whole lot of uncomfortable questions about our identities, what we hold to be inalienable truths, or our way of life. The myth in the poem is about how we think that we know, and how we regard that knowledge as a general paradigm that holds true for most, if not all, human beings. We are in higher education, so it could be said that we are in the the business of knowledge production. So this for us actually really matters. In what follows, I will explore the nature and the consequence of bias and binary thinking, which may lead to our default settings existing and being invisible. I will explore this as it relates to the harmful effects of AI when technology perpetuates bias. I will end with a brief consideration of possible ethical responses to this. So let me go on to my next slide. Bias can be defined as a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. Whether positive or negative, such cognitive shortcuts, can result in prejudgments that lead to rash decisions or discriminatory practices. This manifests itself both in AI bias and discriminatory AI. In her work on the background and implications of artificial intelligence bias, Kimberly Hirsch makes a slight distinction between AI bias and discriminatory AI. Discriminatory AI is the type of AI that is designed to extract data from only a certain demographic. Examples of this include creditworthiness, facial recognition software, and spam filtering emails. However, there is a fine line. When the data sets, a term that we've often heard this morning already, when those data sets are used to design the program to extract data, is one-sided. Discriminatory AI becomes, in essence, AI bias. And I want to give you 3 examples of that. There are, of course, many, many, many examples. In October 2019, researchers found that an algorithm used on more than 200 million people in US hospitals to predict which patients would likely need extra medical care heavily favored white patients over black patients. While race itself wasn't a variable used in this algorithm, another variable highly correlated to race was, which was healthcare cost history. The rationale was that this cost summarizes how many healthcare needs a particular person has. For various reasons, black patients incurred lower healthcare costs while than white patients with the same conditions on average. In 2015, Amazon realized that the algorithm used for hiring employees was found to be biased against women. The reason for that was because the algorithm was based on the number of resumes submitted over the past 10 years. And since most of the applicants were men, it was trained to favor men over women. A final example. In 2016, Rachel Tatman, a researcher in the linguistics department at the University of Washington, found that Google's speech recognition software was 70% more likely to accurately recognize male speech rather than female speech. Now, this has got some knock-on effects. For example, if voice recognition technology is used for GPS locations, and you need to urgently access a certain location for a medical emergency, and your voice as a woman is not recognized by that technology. So according to Hirsch, AI bias refers to a tendency of the AI output to vary based on certain aspects of the testing set and emerges firstly from biased input, training, and sample sets. A data set or testing set or corpus is a collection of data pulled together for analysis or study and consists of text or speech. That text or speech data, that can be used to train AI. Training data is the data that contains labels for different groups so that the machine can learn the characteristics of each group, the basis for supervised machine learning. AI bias, secondly, also emerges from the conscious or unconscious bias of programmers. Therefore, AI bias is when AI output is skewed by variables that are not directly related to the actual function of AI, such as race, class, and gender. As you see on the screen, there are 4 types of AI bias. First of all, we have data-driven bias. This is where the data that serves as input to the AI is skewed by human bias. Then secondly, we have interactive bias. This is when machines are taught to learn from real-world data. Then we have emergent bias, when biased output develops because of a lack of interaction with diverse input over a period of time. And then we have similarity bias, when algorithms manipulate what people see when looking for news and other information online. According to Kate Crawford, the author of the Atlas of AI, there are 2 types of harm that is caused by AI bias. The first one, allocative harm, and the second one, representational. Allocative harm refers to when a system allocates or withholds certain groups an opportunity or resource. Representational harm is when systems reinforce the subordination of certain groups along the lines of identity, like race, class, gender, etc. Stereotyping is a form of representational harm and can be found in word embeddings. In NLP, natural language processing, a word embedding is a representation of a word. The embedding is then used in text analysis. An example would be, man is to computer programmer as woman is to ... and then the word homemaker would be there. Representational harm can reinforce common stereotypes within society. From a philosophical perspective, Crawford suggests addressing AI bias is notoriously difficult and complex. The only true way to eliminate AI bias, she said, is to eliminate human bias. And she also said that AI bias is what drives human bias, or it can. That means it's mutually reinforcing. She does suggest an interdisciplinary approach to address AI bias, which includes governmental policies and private companies forming what she calls an AI bias task force. Addressing AI bias also includes for her the big 4: a linguist, a sociologist or an anthropologist, a philosopher, and an AI programmer. This must be complemented by including in such a task force a lawyer, a psychologist, and an expert in gender studies. The major problem with AI bias in the end, and why it really needs to be addressed, is that it creates a reality where we cannot trust the output of AI. And I think this is what the previous speaker also indicated. In the next 2 sections, I will briefly unpack some ethical responses and conclude with remarks on disrupting the status quo. A possible response, I speak about 2. The one is a culture or community approach, culture community engagement approach, as suggested by Prof Emma Radkamp-Bloem, who is here at UP. And the other one is a human rights values approach that is proposed by UNESCO. So let me start with Ruth Kamp-Bloem's argument. In her work on epistemic justice and a dynamic AI ethics in Africa, which was published last year, Ruth Kamp-Bloem has argued AI ethics is often dominated by Western terminology and approaches. However, if a responsible AI ethics is to be developed, for which the West is not the default, there we use that word again, then AI ethics reflection rather, should take the lived realities of people into account. And the AI ethics reflection should meet people in their own context. For the peoples on the African continent, this would mean that AI ethics should exhibit sensitivity towards the communal nature of African ethics. And as Ruth Kamp-Bloem says, there is an urgent need for a protocol for cultural engagement in AI ethics discussions. Culture should perhaps be the global calculus for AI ethics in the sense of being the source for interpreting it and translating it into familiar terms for each community, she argues. She further says that cross-cultural understanding and collaboration on the one hand, and respect for socio-economic context on the other, may ensure that the responsibility of solidarity with the least advanced to ensure that the benefits of the AI technologies are shared. This is actually a leaf straight out of UNESCO's manifest towards AI ethics and links to a second possible response to AI bias, besides the cultural communal engagement approach that Ruth Kamp-Bloem suggests. She actually juxtaposes this engagement approach to UNESCO's human rights value approach. Now, UNESCO has proposed 10 core principles for a human rights centered approach to AI. The first one is proportionality and do no harm. So in this case, the use of AI systems must not go beyond what is necessary to achieve a legitimate aim. Risk assessment should be used to prevent harms which may result from such uses. The second broad principle is safety and security. Unwanted harms, safety risks, as well as vulnerabilities to attack, security risks, should be avoided and addressed by AI actors. The third broad value of UNESCO is the right to privacy and data protection. The fourth, multi-stakeholder and adaptive governance and collaboration. There, UNESCO emphasizes that international law and national sovereignty must be represented in the use of data. Additionally, participation of diverse stakeholders is necessary for inclusive approaches to AI governance. The fifth principle of UNESCO is focused on responsibility and accountability, namely that AI systems should be auditable and traceable, including oversight and impact assessments. This links to the sixth principle, transparency and explainability. The seventh, human oversight. The eighth, sustainability. The ninth, awareness and literacy, which is important for our context. Public understanding of AI and data should be promoted through open and accessible education, civic engagement, digital skills, and AI ethics training, media and information literacy. And finally, also important for our topic, the final principle is fairness and non-discrimination. All actors should promote social justice, fairness, and non-discrimination while taking an inclusive approach to ensure AI's benefits are accessible to all. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a mouthful. And it's quite easy for a list like that. We live in an era where there are lists of principles and values. And unfortunately, sometimes they become abstract and they become tick box exercises. And it's quite easy for this long list to become a seemingly equal tick box exercise. I think, however, UNESCO might have realized this in some shape or form, because on their on the Ethics of AI webpage, they do say that while values and principles are crucial to establish a basis for any ethical AI framework, recent movements in AI ethics have emphasized the need to move beyond high-level principles and towards practical strategies. For this purpose, they have developed, and that you can see hopefully on the screen, They have developed 11 key areas for policy actions. Now, on your screen, admittedly, it's very small, but I will be able to share this with you. Now, some of the policy areas include ethical governance and stewardship, data policy, development and international cooperation, environment and ecosystems, gender, culture, education and research, communication and information, economy and labor, health and social well-being, and ethical impact assessment. Now, this once again becomes only a mouthful and a tick box exercise if you don't follow the interdisciplinary approach that Kate Crawford has, for example, suggested. UNESCO develops an EIA, an ethical impact assessment, which considers the entire process of designing, developing, and deploying an AI system, allowing for assessment of the risks before and after the system is released to the public. A few days ago, I was fortunate enough that one of the co-workers at the ESTET consortium, the Ethical Consideration Consortium for Considering Socially Disruptive Technologies, which is situated in a consortium in the Netherlands. And one of the co-workers visited my office. She was here on a visit to the country. And I became aware of their work as well. And the main thing that she teaches her students, for example, is when anything is designed, you have to, when you design it, incorporate these values and these principles into the very core of the design. But I will say more about the work that ESTET is doing in my final bit. But based on all these lists of UNESCO and all the values, and the fact that they say that all of these systems must be tested and allowed for assessment of the risk before it's released to the public. My questions are those outside the default included in this design that UNESCO refers to, the development and the deployment? And my further questions are, in the end, who is going to teach the machine or the computer not to be biased? Or is this something that the machine will have to learn by itself at some stage? We'll take responsibility to create more inclusive databases and data sets and testing sets. And I think there's a rather large ethical responsibility on all of us, and I think the previous speaker also showed this, to take more time to learn ourselves about prompt engineering, because I think what you put in is what you are going to get out in the end. One of the main characteristics of feminist ethics is an hermeneutics of suspicion towards how knowledge is constructed. Feminist ethics is not about forcing women's voices into a conversation, something I hear a lot. Rather, feminist ethics is about highlighting the influence of power in the construction of knowledge. At its core, AI is about knowledge production. And if we are in the not too distant future going to accept the knowledge produced by AI as serious and as fact, we will need a framework by which to test that knowledge. Feminist ethics approaches moral dilemmas from an intersectional perspective, while recognizing the inherent dignity of all humanity. It could be that feminist ethics, as an approach to AI bias, combines both the value-driven human rights approach of UNESCO, as well as the cultural emphasis that Rutkamp Bloom advocates for. So in conclusion, a few remarks. An interesting ethical branch of the study of AI is the ethics of socially disruptive technologies, which is what the ESTET consortium does. This refers to technology that is not only impactful, but disrupts some of our conceptual categories, existing institutions, social practices, and beliefs. Socially disruptive technologies include social media, social robots, climate engineering, and new reproductive technologies such as the artificial womb. Socially disruptive technologies lead to profound uncertainty about how to classify matters. For example, is a humanoid robot, which looks and even acts like a human, to be classified as a person, or is it just an inert machine? Conceptual disruption occurs when the meaning of concepts are challenged, and such challenges may potentially lead to a revision of concepts. Now, my closing remark is also a type of a question. Revision of a concept is not ethically speaking bad, could even be considered amoral as opposed to moral or immoral. What could potentially be bad if we use that type of language is if our concepts are immovable to the extent that technologies that are intended to disrupt our preconceptions actually have the opposite effect. That is, technology is keeping a status quo intact or creating a greater imbalance with regard to knowledge, access, and resources. It should actually be counterintuitive that technology perpetuates binary and prejudiced thinking. The irony is, AI is intended to remove human biases. But, as Criado Perez in her book about the gender data gap has stated, if you are not aware of how those biases operate, if you aren't collecting data and taking a little time to produce evidence-based processes, you will continue to blindly perpetuate old injustices. And so I say to you, remember Oedipus. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for your paper, and thank you for intriguing, thought-provoking statements that you've made. While everyone is getting their questions ready, please keep in mind you're more than welcome to type a question in the chat box, and Tanya will respond to that there. If you would like to ask a question, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. By way of kicking off the questions, if I may ask a question from my side, I was intrigued by your statements regarding the default position. And just as to the concept of default, I was thinking immediately, and I just want to hear your views on this. I wonder if there is something like a default position. I would rather think there's, in the plural, many defaults possible, because I think each one have their own preference. So who will become the default, and whose will be preferred, and why? What would be the reasons why somebody's position would be accepted as the default? So those values you refer to become very interesting and important. Now, if we apply this whole conversation on default as to theology, would you perhaps say something about, all right, how does the default theological position look like? I'm just being curious as to what you would say. Is there something like a default theological position or not when it comes to theological education? Just a preliminary question from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaco. Yeah, that's a much longer conversation. I think, first of all, you basically answer that question in a way, because I think there, in a way, is not something as a default, but I think there is a preconceived idea all of us has, that what we regard as knowledge, what we regard as truth, how we understand reality. And I don't necessarily think that all of us are aware to the extent that what we just assume as default knowledge is actually not so much default. It has been influenced by different power constructions. It has been influenced, as the philosophers of language has taught us, it has been influenced by a lot of different constructs. And in the end, language creates reality. We still, AI obviously uses language. We still think many times, if we come to theological education and theology, I see this many times, really up to recently again, that the idea sometimes is that knowledge has sort of fallen from the sky, and that the language that we use to articulate that knowledge and to give it to different generations, that knowledge of that language is also cast in stone. And the dynamic nature of language is not always recognized. And so I think there is not nearly enough, in the words of Criado Perez, an awareness of how we think about how we came to certain aspects of knowledge. How do we think about certain terminologies, ideas? Do we, without critique, just pass these over to subsequent generations without asking them how they came to these knowledge, how they came to these definitions? One of my favorite stories is that when we speak about university students, I think many of us have seen this, when you give students an assignment, and maybe it will change now because they've got technology, for example, to ask. But a student would, over the past 10, 12 years that I've been teaching, many times start an assignment with the words, the dictionary definition of ... And a few years ago, there was a book, I think up to 2-3 years ago, the Dictionary of Lost Words, And I appreciated that book so much because it, in a narrative way, fictional way, narrates the first Oxford dictionary that came into existence. And what we see from the whole process of how words were chosen to be into a dictionary, we are not even aware that choices enter into the very fabric of how we think a dictionary operates. And we think a dictionary is neutral. What the story, the narrative pointed out is that even the way that words are defined is not neutral. And I think that is something when it comes to language and default settings and predisposed ideas of bias that we need to take really seriously, and we need to engage with this. We need to ask others to help us to point out blind spots. And we are in the business of knowledge production. So it's a long answer. I don't think there should be a theological default position, but I do encounter many of those. And it's usually connected to an unawareness of how people themselves have constructed their own knowledge. And when it comes to theological knowledge and religious knowledge, it becomes much more complex because you are talking about realities beyond your own reality. And many times I don't think necessarily recognize that we actually just mirror our own biases in that language. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Jaco. I see the other hands and I saw some comments. You will moderate that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I see there are two hands raised at the stage, Johan and then Rian Rede. So let's have the two questions, and then Tanya, I'll give you opportunity to respond. First Johan and then Rian, and then we'll give Tanya an opportunity to respond.
Thanks, Jaco. Mine are more comments than a question, but maybe Tanya would like to reply anyway. Something about responsibility. Who takes responsibility for these models? I think the developers must take responsibility, but also the users. I spoke mostly about the users that would have a responsibility to apply, critical, who will have to engage critically with the outputs of these models and their function within society. But I think what the UN and the European Union with their acts are driving at is to force the developers to build into their models, guardrails and reinforcement to address these issues of gender and race biases. And I think that is what Rutkamp Bloom has it as well. She applies basically Nussbaum's capabilities approach, which is an instance of human rights, also to AI models. What kind of world do we want to live in? What do we create? Now, the contentious issue is, of course, that these developers would not share the same values. The new chatbot or AI model from Musk, for example, Grok 2, doesn't have any guardrails. So you'll find all kinds of racist things in there. There's no moderation there. He doesn't have any concern for that. And because of the United States not applying, these values, but supporting free speech as a value, anything goes, he can get away with it. Another case in point would be China, where facial recognition is not an issue. The European Union Act forbids that. And the interesting thing is, when I started to experiment with these models, one could ask it to create an image. This is now not text, but you give a text prompt and it creates an image, let's say, of a Muslim woman in a laboratory, and it would do it. If you do it now, it would refuse to do it. Even if it would blur faces. So you get the message, I blur faces. So that guardrail was now built into the model due to the European Act. But China would not have a problem with that. They use cameras everywhere. Facial recognition is not a problem there. So, how do one enforce, these things? There is no body. The UN can't enforce these rules. They can make an act, but it's up to individual countries, nation states, to implement them or not. And still, you then face the problem of, the websites are internationally accessible. The nation state can't prevent people from here to access elsewhere. Of course, China can prevent people from accessing many Western sites. It's up to the nation state to implement these rules. Maybe, Tanya, you have some ideas about how to address that issue of, getting these values to be agreed on, how it can be negotiated.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Johan.
Let's first give Rian an opportunity, and then you can respond to both questions, if that's fine, Tanya. Thank you, Rian. You're welcome.
Yes, thank you, Prof Jaco. Just a short comment on the question with regarding to the default position. That answer would depend on what you understand with the concept of default position. So I understand it not as an ultimate position, but as a preset state, or a starting point. So within the context of IA, you'll always have, it's like a presupposition, you'll always have, every creator of an artificial bot like ChatGPT will have a default position. But I think part of the answer is to include all different possible default positions which you can ask for, or which will be automatically be part of an answer. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tanya. You may respond to both questions if you like.
Thank you so
Of
much.
comments, yeah.
Thank you. So I did a short practical project in my religious community last year. I was studying responsible leadership. I did another degree, and I did a short practical project that spoke to a very small group of people, because our time was limited, about perceptions about women leaders. So I had to frame the question as broad as possible, because I didn't want to lead with the question. I didn't want the question to have an answer already in it. I didn't want the question to come with preconceived ideas, because it's me asking this question. And in the church, I'm known as a feminist theologian. So I had to phrase the question very specifically. What I learned from this very small and short practical project is that we, as a human species, struggle with nuance. So I received lots of interesting responses from places where it's people where I didn't think it was going to come from. So even me trying to come to the situation with the most open mind as possible, I was surprised. I got positive or encouraging or helpful responses from persons I did not expect it to come from, and I received not as helpful responses from people where I would have expected it to come. So basically, to Johan and Rian and Johan about the values and how do we connect this, and Rian about the default. What I realized in this process is that in the end, we won't be able to iron out all our biases and blind spots, because we are simply too human. The problem is, or the challenge, or that's not a problem, is that as much as I understand AI, and I understand very little, is that it's supposed to, at some stage, or at this stage even, help us overcome these things that are in a way, or assist us with these things that are so inherently human. And at this stage, it's not doing that, because we are inputting it with our own biases. What will it take to get people together to talk about this? From my practical project, I saw that if you start with a small group of people and you create an awareness from multiple disciplines, and I think this is what Kate Crawford advocates for, that is a starting point. I think basically, it's a much longer conversation. I really appreciate your comments and inputs. The thing is with the default is everyone must depart from a specific position. I absolutely agree, because nothing comes from nothing. It really is about if you are aware of how your starting point has been constructed. If you are aware of the different intersectional aspects that led into you departing from the starting point. That's why in gender studies and feminist studies, we often get this little picture. You would have seen it a million times. It's about two people standing next to podiums, and the one is equality and the other one is equity. And the one, equality, is all the podiums are the same. Equity is the podiums are at different stages, so at different levels. So I think one of the things in this debate would be important to take cognizance of that different definition between equality and equity, because I think what we need in this conversation would probably be a greater input on equity. Thank you so much, Rian and Johan. Love the conversation, and thanks, Jaco.
Thank you. Are there perhaps any other questions, more comments perhaps for Tanya? I don't see any hands raised.
I see just in the chat from Aris Marima that he poses that the default is likely to be the dominant perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Tanya, you heard a comment in the chat box. You want to respond to that perhaps?
There's always a dominant discourse and a sub-discourse. And interesting, the philosophy and the theory tells us that the dominant discourse doesn't know about the sub-discourses, but the sub-discourses always know the content of the dominant one, because simply of the way that their sub-discourses is influenced by the dominant discourse. And that is also something I think we need to take note of. So thanks for that. And also thanks to Dion for posting the link to the UNESCO site in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Dion has raised his hand as well. Dion, you're welcome. You may ask a question or make a comment.
Thank you very much. Prof Tanya, thank you for the paper, for the presentation. Very, very insightful. I wasn't aware of this UNESCO movement. Knowing a little bit about the technology underlying the language models used, there is a mechanism built in to get rid of bias that in the first language models it was known as the 3 H's. It must be helpful, honest, and harmless. And the 2 mechanisms that's built in is first of all the feedback. I think Dr. Johan showed us the mechanism there where you can directly respond to an answer given by the facility, whether you say you like it or not. So because it's a generative model, that means that the model can only mirror something that is available from a technical point of view. So the more to get rid of bias, the only way is to change. The only way in which we can contribute is to change the narrative by availing more and more text and sources to the technology, to the developers. So in essence, if we find something offensive, to respond to it, but also to avail opinions in text and in writing through the technology. So that's the only way by which we will be able to get language that's more inclusive. For instance, the first model that was available, if you were to ask it the question, tell me a joke about a man, it will give you that joke, a joke. If you were to ask the question, tell me a joke about women, it would not be able to give such an answer. But today, it does do it in a sense that it means it is not offensive. And if you say, but this was offensive, then it will respond to say, well, I'm sorry, and then it will try and give you something according to the model that is a more light-hearted joke. But that kind of adjustment that was made and evolution that took place is all based on the fine-tuning mechanisms of the technology, and that's the only way in which we will be able to contribute to make adjustments to the technology to be more inclusive, less bias, etc.
Thank you, Dion. Tanya would like to respond.
I think that's very interesting. Thank you so much, Dion. I always wonder if I hear the sentence, we have to correct something that is what is the word that you used, offensive. I totally agree with the movement today that highlights offensive language, but I really actually even want us from in a perfect world to go a step back, so that we don't end up by making political correct statements, but that we actually from the get-go realize that from a broader humanitarian perspective, and in our case a theological perspective, where a lot of us included in this call actually depart from theological foundation, which is inherently inclusive, that from that departure point, we from the get-go think differently, and not only in the end say, but this is offensive or that is offensive, although it is probably very offensive. We can easily get to a point where we are getting to political correctness or atmosphere where we actually don't really realize, but where we started from was a default position, which was problematic. And I think this is the big challenge for us ahead. So really, thank you so much for that. Thank you, Jaco.
Good, thank you. Now I see we are nearing the cut-off time, so I would suggest we end the conversation here. Of course, with the invitation that you can either continue a conversation with Tanya in email. So Tanya, thank you for now for your paper and your contribution. Highly appreciated. Thank you.